Hi, welcome to the History Talks. I'm your host, Will. This is Sebastian. In this episode, we continue our series on communist revolutions in the 20th century, and we will be doing our second part on the communist revolution in China. So in our last episode, we ended with Mao Zedong and his Communist Party had just officially taken control of China in the year 1949. So tell us, what happened at that point?
In 49, Mao, to a cheering up crowd, officially declared the People's Republic of China would be founded, and immediately he began working on reforming China into his image. Now, there were some roadblocks, namely in the fact that in 1950, literally a year later, the Korean War started, which, the short version, North Korea tries to invade South Korea. They get kind of close, but then the U.S. gets involved and pushes back North Korea.
All right, let's stop for a second there. Why did the U.S. want to get involved in this?
Because they wanted to support South Korea, which was their main American capitalist-leaning foothold on the Asian mainland.
Okay, so I don't want to go too far off into a tangent, but this does come back and impact Chinese Communist Revolution. So America, or I should say, the United States government was aligned with the communists in World War II. Only a few years earlier, only a few years before 1950, they were aligned with the communists in World War II, right? With the Soviets. So we come around in 1950, all of a sudden they want to fight again against the communists. Do you think, was China involved in that in any way, or is that something going on the other side of the world had nothing to do with the Chinese Communist Revolution?
It wasn't directly related with China. Even during World War II, there were tensions in between the Soviets and the Americans, but they had a common enemy, so...
Okay. And I think that would be interesting to discuss, or have an episode, perhaps, about that topic. Mm-hmm. But especially, since we are talking about communist revolutions in the 20th century. But back to what was going on in China, or specifically South Korea.
Mm-hmm. So the Korean War starts, so America gets involved on the side of the South Koreans, and they push North Korea back past the border, past Pyongyang. But once they get close to the Chinese border, China gets involved on North Korea's side and pushes the battle back to the center of Korea. There was a stalemate for a moment, and then in 1953 they sign a stalemate. They sign a ceasefire, creating the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, and
the DMZ is the border between North and South Korea.
Yeah.
So the Chinese were aiding the North Koreans, and the United States government was aiding the South Koreans. So do you think Korea was really a proxy for a war between the United States and China?
It was a proxy for the war between the United States and communism in general.
Because both the Soviets and the Chinese, were they both aiding North Korea?
The Soviets were more indirectly aiding, whereas the Chinese were more direct in sending troops.
So you think that the U.S. involvement in this was more anti-communist than specifically fighting, going over to Asia and fighting specifically against China through Korea as a proxy?
Yeah, okay. I mean,
it's fair enough.
I don't want to go too far into a tangent about McCarthyism or whatever,
right?
But what you need to know about the U.S. at this time is they have this theory called domino effect, where they believe that if one country falls to communism, then the next, then the next, then the next, etc., etc.
Okay.
But
yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. I know we're specifically talking about the Chinese Revolution here, but it's so interesting, the U.S. involvement in that. Being like you said, the U.S. viewed itself as having a common enemy. We could discuss why in another episode, but only a few years earlier aligning itself with the Soviets. And then coming out in the early 1950s and pushing back on the other side of the world, right? Or, Korea is clearly nowhere near North America, but going out to the other side of the world to intervene, specifically to push back against communism, is really interesting. And so, that's interesting since we're here in the United States. It's interesting how that foreign policy, we still have interventionist foreign policy, but what was Zedong's response to this? What did he think of he wanted to go and take, or did he want North Korea, or he just wanted North Korea to be allied with him, and he also wanted South Korea, so he wanted to expand his influence?
He would have preferred it. He would have preferred a North Korean victory, but from the beginning, neither the Soviet nor the Chinese leadership thought that that Korean War would end well. That was mainly Kim Sung-il, I believe his name was, the leader of North Korea's thinking that the other powers just eventually got involved in.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering, if this was more about the Chinese communists expanding their power into Korea, or is more about pushing back against American influence, I want to correct myself anytime I say U.S. government rather than Americans, because I think there's a difference between the American people and the U.S. government. But was this more about the Chinese communists trying to expand power into Korea, or was it more about pushing back against an attempt by the U.S. government to gain a foothold in Asia?
I'd say it's more the Chinese government wanted to protect all existing influence.
Okay, I wanted to protect. Okay, so it was about pushing back against the U.S. government at this point. It seemed like the U.S. government was trying to expand its influence into Asia, and the Chinese communists wanted to hold their ground. And North Korea was where Korea in general was where they held their ground, and the result was, after 3 years of fighting, coming up with a DMZ between North and South Korea. Okay.
Yeah. But that was more tangentially related. The point I wanted to get to is that this war served as a bit of a distraction, but Mao, even through this, was able to pass some reforms to advance his whole thing.
Okay, so this was something on the side for him. His main focus was what was actually going on in China.
Yeah.
Okay. And what kind of reforms did he promote?
Well, initially he was modeling it off of Stalin's model. Maybe not quite as he wasn't quite sending as many people to gulags yet, but he did see Stalin's model of increasing productivity and thought that could work.
Okay, well, let's go back to the gulags. So they had Chinese gulags?
Or not quite yet.
Oh, not quite yet. So he really wasn't using the gulag. He didn't have we know that Stalin essentially took his political enemies and either killed them or shipped them off to the gulag, right? So that was not going on as much with Zedong. He didn't need to do that. Was it just that his enemies were not as much of a threat, or he didn't have the power to go
more
and
just he didn't see most of his enemies were in Taiwan, so.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Okay, so
aside from local peasant resistance, he didn't really have much to worry about politically.
Interesting.
All he had to do was make sure that he had a loyal officer corps.
Okay, so there were some peasants who resisted. That's kind of interesting, since the communism is supposed to support the workers and things like that. So it was actually rather than having a nobility or some sort of class like that you would think is supposed to lose from communism, he actually had the peasants fighting back against it. But you're saying they didn't have the power to organize and any sort of meaningful resistance to him.
Yeah. And initially he was able to get productivity somewhat up until in 54 he initiated 53 he initiated the first 5-year plan, and success, actually, surprisingly, believe it or not.
What was his 5-year plan?
To basically have state-constructed industries to build up the Chinese economy and have workers meet certain quotas.
Okay, and that's what he called it, was the 5-year plan.
Yeah.
And that's kind of interesting. This is also a tangent. It's kind of interesting in the corporate world, in Western culture, or in the United States in particular. That's kind of I don't know if you'd call it maybe a meme. That's kind of a common thing where you go in for a job interview and the person in HR or the interviewer says, "Well, tell me what's your 5-year plan?" That kind of thing, which is kind of funny that's something you see in the corporate world and in a place like the United States, but in the 1850s that was also a term used in communist China.
Yeah. Though there was one area where the plan was not as successful as he would like it to be. Agriculture. Now agriculture was quite important to Mao. You see, Mao had this philosophy, we call it Maoism now. Basically, he believed that while China has a lot to gain and learn from the Soviet model, it should not follow the Soviet model exactly. He wanted, as he called it, communism with Chinese characteristics.
Interesting.
And one thing he saw, especially later in life, but also to an extent now, or at this point, he saw as part of that might be a more agriculturally focused economy, as opposed to, the raw industrialism of the West or Russia.
I see. Okay, so he saw that as the difference. The communism with Chinese characteristics was more agriculture-based rather than industrial-based. And that's interesting. Really, if you think about it, how Marx was writing from Europe, and I'm assuming at this point Zedong considered himself a Marxist, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting. He essentially wanted to take Marxist ideas, look at what had been done in the Soviet Union, take certain parts of that, but not keep all of it. He wanted to make it Chinese. He wanted to make a Chinese version of Marxism and Soviet policy, and he wanted to implement that, and it was going to be agriculture based. But you said the agriculture part did not go as well.
Yeah. Basically, he he started out not actually abolishing private property. He learned from Lenin that immediately doing that is not a good idea.
Okay.
But what he did was instead establish a collectivization system. Basically, the whole idea is that within each community, you'd have a collective, and that collective could basically have people share things like tools, farm animals, etc., from each according to his ability, to each according to his need.
Okay.
And then each collective would be part of a greater collective of like a whole bunch of towns that would share with each other.
Okay.
And
so collectives, so they had shared property, but they didn't abolish private property. So what did that mean? For example, you could still own your house, you could still own your residence, but you might share all the tools you use to do your job.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was not, absolutely a failure, but it was starting to become clear to Chinese statisticians that Chinese population growth was slowly starting to outpace agricultural growth.
Okay, and this is in the mid-1950s, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so they're anticipating a Malthusian disaster, which Malthusian disaster, of course, that means essentially where the population outgrows the ability to produce food, and you have starvation or some sort of massive correction of population based off of that. So at this time, the central planners were foreseeing potentially a Malthusian disaster.
Yeah. So at first
they weren't there yet, but they were anticipating it because they could see the population growing, but they did not see the agriculture technology keeping up with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And agricultural production in general.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, production in general. That's good. I guess I used the technology as a as a system whereby you are able to be productive part of it is the technology, part is the implementation of the technology, right? You could have the greatest technology in the world, if you don't know how to use it, you could still starve. Whatever the case is, they're not producing the amount of food they need to maintain their level of population growth. So they recognize this before it happens.
Yeah.
Okay. Or before any kind of mass starvation happens.
Yeah. So they start coming up with ideas to get the workers to, do more, to produce more. Plus, they have some upcoming trade deals with the Soviet Union where the Soviets will give them some technology in exchange for Chinese grain. So they say, okay, well, what if we have a policy where workers have to meet certain quotas, and let's say, if the town produces the amount of food we needed to meet the Soviet trade deal and maintain our population, then hey, you might get to eat. Or you might get the fruits of your labor. So, so they tried that, and it worked somewhat.
And so the Soviets, that sounds like that may have been an asymmetrical deal they did with the Soviets, technology for grain. Unless the Soviets just had a shortage of grain, or were the Soviets giving them basically a good deal because they wanted to help spread communism, and they said, well, hey, our technology may be more valuable than grain, but we'll go ahead and give it to you.
For the Soviets, it was, spreading communism. Mainly what they were looking at is basically the idea was, you build up China into what can later become a more symmetric partner.
Okay, so they're thinking longer term, because basically, and this is interesting. It's interesting that you brought up grain, right? So the Chinese central planners are worried about not being able to produce enough food for the population. So they say, let's trade grain away. You would think that if they're worried about starvation, at least in the near term, they would want to keep their grain. But perhaps they were thinking longer term. Maybe if we have or maybe they had a surplus of the food at this time. Actually, they were just anticipating that surplus was not going to last. And that means the Russians must have, if the Russians valued grain at all, did that mean that they were having some sort of similar problems? Their agricultural production was lagging behind the population?
You could say that.
Okay, that's interesting. So this may have been a mutual problem in both of the major communist powers at the time.
Yeah.
Okay.
So China is able to make sure that that grain production is because of these quotas, its production is more stable. But Mao wants to go further. And this leads to 1958.
Okay.
The Great Leap Forward. And this is where stuff gets turned up to 11.
Wow.
So Mao wants to. Classical Marxist theory says that the point of the proletariat dictatorship is to transition the country into a state where it can become the stateless, classless, currency-less utopia Marx envisioned.
Right, so that's what they mean when they talk about the Great Leap Forward. They're doing a Marxist analysis of the world, right? They're looking through Marxism, and according to Marxist analysis, his dialectic, right? We'll call it the Marxist dialectic. There are certain stages of history that humanity is supposed to go through. So they viewed, and the final stage is, like you mentioned, this stateless communist utopia, right? This anarcho-communist, and we're all just happy and share everything and that sort of thing, right? That's the final stage, right? And so when Zedong said we're going to take a great leap forward, that's what he's thinking. That's what they mean by that, is that they are going to move up from one major section, one chapter in this arc of history over to the next major stage towards that utopia.
So Mao's first act is making sure that his entire core of people in government is on board with this whole Great Leap Forward idea. Some of them already were, some of them even more so than him, and some he had to replace.
Okay, so he wanted to make sure they were true believers in the Marxist dialectic, the Marxist narrative on history, right?
Mhm.
Because if you're a true believer, then you think that a step forward is always a step towards this communist utopia.
Yeah.
Okay. So he made sure he cleaned out everybody who was not a true believer. He made sure all the true believers were there, and some of them were even more gung-ho about pushing to the next level than he was, which he was okay with. Because they were, as long as they were true believers, okay.
Yeah. So first he abolishes private property.
Okay. This is in 1958. Okay.
Yeah. He uses the police, of course, but even more. But one tactic I remember reading about is having
the police rather than the military. Or is there not much of a distinction in his?
He used both basically.
Okay. Okay. I didn't know if there was any significance to it being the police versus the military, or anyway. So he uses both. He uses basically all the state's monopoly on violence. He uses that to confiscate property, private property, from all citizens.
Yeah, but one tactic I remember reading about that there was some evidence he used even more, and I thought was kind of funny. Basically, he would have representatives go to a town, say, "Hey, we're doing this new policy." They would have them all go to the town hall and discuss the policy, and if the peasants weren't in on it, weren't good with it, they would just say, "All right." And they would just lock the doors of the town hall and then just keep them there until they agreed.
Okay, so that's similar. I remember when we talked about the Russian or the Soviet Revolution, didn't they do something very similar? Used a very similar technique? I think I remember we discussed this a few episodes back where we talked about, I believe it was under Stalin. They would go and they would have a meeting in different communities, and your options are either kind of well, you can agree with us. Mm-hmm. Which we prefer, or you can disagree. You have that choice to disagree, but we might just throw you in the gulag or kill you if you disagree. See, so those are kind of your choices. So it sounds like they did something similar here.
Yeah,
they're kind of like we're going to give you two options. You can agree with us or disagree, and then if you disagree, we're just going to make you agree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
So he does this, and then he's he's doing all these things. One of the most wacky things I remember is he tried to get people to put steel mills in their backyards. Basically all these ideas of his.
Steel mill in your backyard? I figured you need more space than that.
Yeah, well, he had this idea of, oh hey, we can still do industrial things while being primarily agricultural. That makes sense.
Oh, okay, backyard, because I guess these are people who have farms and they have more land to do it. Okay, so he wanted every man to have his own steel factory, essentially.
Yep, everyone's producing grain, everyone's producing rice, everyone's
interesting.
Everyone's working, and it's all being centrally planned, but eventually they'll finish the Great Leap Forward and they'll establish their communist utopia or whatever.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know what's interesting is how this is kind of strange. If you think about it, that is a little similar to the Western idea of the yeoman, right? The independent, like the pioneer or the settler, the independent farmer who goes out and claims his plot of land and is completely independent, and he can do whatever he needs. He can grow food, and he can build his own house, and he can, his family, within the family unit, they can sew their own clothes and that sort of thing, right? They can do all that and sort of independently, which is an idea you would associate with Western liberty and that sort of thing. He actually wanted something. It sounds like a little bit similar to that, although it was all centrally planned. I guess that was the significant difference. It was the central planning, and also you're saying at this time there was no private property. So when you say every family or every independent group had their own steel mill, I guess that means I don't know exactly how that works. I guess you have an area where you sleep at every night, so maybe it's that area. You work at that, you have it right next to you, but it's not yours. It's somebody. I don't know how that works exactly. If I'm like, oh, this is the house we sleep in at night. If it's not mine, does that mean if one of the neighbors or somebody down the street decided they want to sleep here tonight, does that mean they just come over and they do, or do I don't know exactly how that worked, but
yeah, for all their foresight in other various programs, it seems that there were various ideas in this Great Leap Forward that were just, advanced to utopia, whatever, and not as well thought out.
Huh? So utopians didn't have a very realistic appraisal of how the world works. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, not really surprising there. I guess that's kind of how utopians think. They don't like to take into account reality, because when you take into account reality, it kind of pokes a hole in your utopian ideas. So anyway, so they were just going along and saying, well, let's just come up with these ideas, and let's just implement these things. They sound good. And when we sit around and discuss Marxist ideology and how we're going to go through this arc of history, and then so the people, so this is 1958, so they implement it, and they have to implement it by force. They say, we came up with these ideas, and you have two options. You can either like it and go along with it, or you can like it and go along with it. Those are your choices.
Yeah.
So how do the people feel at this time? Are they kind of just like, well, all right, they know what they're doing there, or was there resistance among the people?
It varied. It varied depending on regions, communities, people. Lots of different people had different views of what was going on. Though a lot of people were at least somewhat resistant, especially out in the countryside.
Right.
But eventually. And they keep doing this until 1961. Until 1961, they keep coming up with ideas like, I mentioned steel mills, but also like, we'll have socialist schools. We'll have.
Okay, what's a social school as opposed to a regular school?
But one of the main focuses of the education is how to be a good communist worker, how to support your commune properly.
Okay, I see. Huh. Yeah, I wonder how many ideas are pushed in the public schools in the United States today.
Yeah.
Right, because it is a public school. It's run by the state.
Yeah.
It's
not like private schools exist.
Yeah. There you go. So. Well, did they have them there? Were they allowed to do? I wonder if it was compulsory, like it is here. How we have compulsory education. You're required to go, till you're around 16 or so. Did they have the same kind of thing? Everybody was like state school.
It's one of those things where it was, technically compulsory, but enforceability really depended on, where you lived.
Okay, so it's actually not a whole lot different than our system here. Yeah, you can go to private school. A lot of people can't afford it. You could do homeschooling, but I'm saying a lot of people go to these state-run schools here.
Yeah. Right. So, anyways, 1961, they officially have to call it off. It's just not working out. And this.
What do they call off?
The Great Leap Forward.
So the Great Leap Forward lasts 3 years. What happens? People are starving.
That is the biggest thing.
Yeah, that's a pretty big problem.
Allow me. So the most common estimate for deaths as a result of this Great Leap Forward is about 45 million.
So 45 million people die, of starvation? Or was it being killed by their own military?
Main of starvation.
Okay.
And even socialist sources sometimes estimate as high as 30 million.
Okay.
And I've seen at least a couple historians estimate as high as 70 million.
Okay, so the exact number is unknown.
But 45 is the most commonly accepted
45 is
number.
the most common, and you think when people come up with the number 45 million, that's not based on their political bias. That's based on them actually trying to come up with an accurate number, right? Because like you're saying, socialist sources are going to say, oh yeah, it's not that bad. It was only 30 million people. What's 30 million people, right?
Yeah.
They're going to say that, whereas you're saying people who are very anti-communist are going to double the number or something like that.
Yeah.
So so you think the actual number is somewhere in between, somewhere around 45 million.
That seems to be historians' consensus.
Okay, so 45 million people died in 3 years? Or is this since 1949?
This is from 1958 until all the effects of the Great Leap Forward are fully reversed, which is shortly after 1961.
Oh, so in 3 years, 45 million people die in 3 years, predominantly of starvation.
Yeah.
Wow, that's brutal. How many people died during the Soviets?
Exactly. Get this. The Holocaust and Stalin's gulags combined killed less people.
Yeah. Stalin's gulag. How many died in Stalin's gulags?
About 20 million.
20 million, and there was the Holodomor, right?
Which was 3 million.
That was 3 million. What other? Okay, so we have 20 million, 3 million,
and then the Holocaust killed about 11 million, I think.
Oh, is it? Okay, that seems like the number gets revised a lot.
I've heard like 6 million Jews and then 5 million like gypsies and POWs.
Yeah,
and stuff.
World War II as a whole, if you look at the number of Europeans that died in it, I think it's much larger number. So, but if we focus just on communist causes, and so most of the causes of death during communist rule are not from state violence. Some may be from state violence. Mm-hmm. Stalin was violent toward his own people, but it sounds like the majority come from starvation. Is that what happened with the Soviets too? That 20 million number, is that most?
The 20 million is gulags. 3 million died in Holodomor.
Oh, so the Soviets, it's mostly state violence.
Yeah.
Kill people. 3 million's not 3 million's a pretty significant number, but
yeah.
Okay, so Soviets, it's mostly just violence directed at the people.
Yeah.
The people who are resistant to the communism. And China, has less to do with state violence and more to do with just absolute mismanagement.
Yeah.
45 million, that's incredible.
Yeah.
In 3 years, too.
Yeah.
Okay.
And while, the rest of Mao's reign wouldn't reach that number combined in terms of deaths.
Oh, the rest just this 3... So even though he completely mismanages his country, 45 million people die, he's still able to hold on to power after this.
Yeah.
Do you think the 45 million people who died, do you think it was intentional? He was like, you know what? We don't need these people. Let's just weed them out. Or do you think it was just simply he actually thought he was doing something great and was going to lift these people to this new great leap forward? And he actually had good intentions. He was just completely
totally
incompetent.
He was just totally oblivious as to what his policies would actually do. It seems like, especially given after the fact, he made excuses like, "Oh, it was because we had a bad harvest. Yeah. That's what it was. If we did it under more optimal weather conditions or whatever, it wouldn't work."
So no accountability with him. There was always another cause. It had never had to do.
Yeah.
Because like we discussed, he was a true believer and he surrounded himself with only true believers.
Yeah.
So because a good leader, if you look through the historical record, a good leader, well, they're going to have people around them who are going to help them carry out their plan of action, but they're also going to have advisors close to them who have a different perspective, who will pose questions to them.
Yeah.
To say, hey, have you thought about this? You might be missing this. So a wise king or a wise leader is going to have people like that. There's a difference between some of those people want to undermine, but when you have somebody who in good faith is asking questions, what if this happens? What about that? That can be very useful. But it sounds like he didn't have anybody like that. He purged anybody who wasn't an absolute true believer. They were all completely obsessed with pushing us forward, and they go out and kill tens of millions of people.
Yeah.
But after 1961, that's when he realizes this isn't working.
Yeah.
We're just killing everybody.
So he makes these excuses about bad harvests, and then he goes on to try to do other reforms, maybe help China a little more.
Oh, more reforms. So 1961.
After 1961, he officially declares the end of the Great Leap Forward and reverses all of the Great Leap Forward era reforms.
Wow. So what, they go back to the 1958 policy before the Great Leap Forward?
Yeah.
Okay.
And from this point, he's just trying to...
And does the starvation end at this point?
Yeah, the starvation starts to end.
Okay.
But by then, the damage has been done.
People don't have steel mills in their backyard.
Yeah. I mean, that wasn't going to work anyway.
Right.
But now Mao is just trying to deal with any lingering problems as a result of this, and trying to hold on to his power. And it does get a bit difficult at times, mainly because of one thing: the Sino-Soviet split. Now, for a long time, China and the Soviet Union have been signing treaties, doing all this stuff, but now relations are starting to fall apart because China has nuclear technology from the Soviets now.
Okay.
And
in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the U.S. they're doing the Vietnam War at this point. And
that's an interesting thing too. Was that do you think that was a similar strategy by the U.S. government as it was in Korea, which was essentially to put a foot in or gain a foothold in Asia, and at the same time push back against communist influence?
It's more like keeping a foothold, because Vietnam was previously a French colony, but then communists rose up, and also anti-communists who also opposed the French rose up, and they said, all right, we're going to favor these capitalist forces over the communist forces, and the French were like, all right, well, I guess we'll just have to give up Vietnam.
I guess I say, I mean, we're going off the topic of China, so I just want to say this very briefly, but the reason I specifically say gaining a foothold in Asia is because there were the Eastern Bloc countries, like Eastern Germany and things like that, which the United States culturally and historically has much more significant ties to, yet we were not intervening there as much. I know we had these things, like Radio Free Europe, and we had these indirect ways of pushing back, using propaganda and information warfare, but the actual physical fighting, bringing in guns and planes and things like that, was done in Asia. Yeah. Which I think is interesting. And that, as they're saying, these are different topics we could go to. I think it relates back to China, but I think it's an interesting question: is why was the United States government at this time so focused on fighting in Asia? Yeah. So was China involved in pushing back or fighting the U.S. government in Vietnam?
I mean, keep in mind, Vietnam began in '55. The U.S. has been fighting this for a while, and
right. So Korea, U.S. was in Korea from what, 50 to 53.
Yeah.
And then Vietnam began in 55.
Yeah.
But China was involved in Korea.
Yeah.
Directly, they were sending their own soldiers to war. Was China involved in Vietnam?
Not directly.
So they may have sent supplies or sent weapons or something like that, but they were not sending their own soldiers.
Yeah. Though there was the threat. Basically, they kind of made it seem like, oh yeah, U.S., if you actually land troops in the north of Vietnam and don't just air bomb them, you just actually land troops, and we're going to get involved.
Interesting. That's an interesting line that they drew there, where they said you can bomb them, just don't no boots on the ground there.
Yeah, and they have to stay in southern Vietnam.
Okay, and you also mentioned earlier, I think it was in around 1949 or sometime in the 1950s, you said that Zedong didn't have a whole lot of resistance within China, but he did have some resistance, I think you said, in Vietnam. Is that correct?
In basically all the politically significant anti-communists were joined the Kuomintang in their exile in Taiwan.
Oh, Taiwan. Okay, you said Taiwan rather than Vietnam. That's right. Okay, so that's interesting. So at this point, China took a step back. I mean, maybe it's because they had mass starvation going on. They had their own problems to deal with. They're not going to get involved in in Vietnam when they can't even feed their own people.
Yeah, so they're recovering their production, and they do actually manage. And because so many people died, they are actually able to have a lot more sustainable food production.
Okay, so that's why I was asking. I mean, it sounds absolutely brutal, but I actually wonder if that's why I was asking. Could that have been part of their central planning? As they said, look, we just have too many people. Let's kill off, just tens of millions of people, and then we'll be at a stable population. That I wonder if there's a possibility.
And I mean, given the wording of the internal documents, it's highly unlikely.
Okay.
But you never know.
Okay, so you don't believe that's what it was.
Yeah.
Okay, just because you hear accusation, like when you talk about like the, like famine in Ireland, there's fingers pointed back to the British monarch of accusations like that there was intentional starvation. There's different arguments. Yeah, there's different arguments, but I'm just saying, sometimes you hear things where maybe central planners. There may be accusations, whether it's true or not. You seem to think it's not, but I just wanted to bring that up just in case.
Yeah. So at this point, Mao, he's not getting involved in Vietnam, but he is. He's having some conflict with the Soviet Union. They both have nuclear technologies, and with the U.S. busy doing other things, China is starting to see the Soviets as an even bigger threat to China than the United States of America. After all, what's the U.S. going to do? Invade mainland China? That's not a good idea.
Right, they're not going to do that because they know the Chinese have nuclear weapons, right?
Yeah.
Is that why? That's the deterrent?
Nuclear weapons, and also just even after the mass starvation, China still had a sizable amount
so they have a significant they have a good force, a strong military, and they also have nuclear weapons. So for the U.S. to get involved there, the U.S. so they may fight proxies. That's why I say they fight proxies like Korea or Vietnam.
Yeah.
And then they have these certain lines where the U.S. government will say, "We'll come close to you." Close. We'll push up. We'll go right up against the line, but we're not going to cross that line where you start trying to nuke us or something like that, right? But that's interesting. So, I guess China and Russia share a border, right?
Yeah.
The U.S. is on the other side of the world. So that's interesting. So we're talking in the 1960s, right? Where there's supposed to be conflict between the Chinese and the Russians, and what's that about? They're both ideologically Marxist, right? They both want to get to this Marxist utopia. So what is it? Is it
Keep in mind that that they share this border. So eventually, with the U.S. basically not invading mainland China, not having any of its proxies have a direct border with mainland China, Mao is starting to see the Soviet Union as a greater threat. And keep in mind,
why would the Soviet Union be a threat to them? Is it because the Soviet Union wanted to take over China as a communist colony?
Well, because the Soviet Union was the only one who could potentially, take over China, replace their leadership, whatever, and remember, this is years after Stalin's death.
Okay, so who's in charge now? Khrushchev?
I believe so. And Khrushchev is much more moderate than Stalin.
Oh, much more moderate.
As I recall, if I remember correctly, Khrushchev actually ended the Gulag system.
Okay, so Khrushchev is more moderate, yet Zedong is still in power in China, and he is a true believer. He is not a moderate, right? He wants to just push forward as far as he can. Okay, so that's interesting, but so Khrushchev may be more practical or realistic.
Yeah.
He wants to. Is that it? He wants to expand. He wants to rule over China. Is that intention, or maybe parts of China?
As far as the leadership of China was concerned, it was a looming threat. We don't. There's no evidence in the Russian internal documents that they had any plans of the sort, but the threat was looming.
Yeah, because I mean, Russia has so much land. What do they even want Chinese territory for? What would I? You know what I mean? What would be the benefit to them? Unless it's just power. It's just, hey, we want to rule the world. You know. But
yeah.
Okay, so whether it was a real threat or not, it was perceived as a threat.
Yeah.
By the Chinese communists.
So
they may have been pushing back against Russia at this point because they thought they may be a threat.
Yeah, it started with Khrushchev. Previously they had been doing let's do asymmetric trade deals to build up China.
Okay.
It started with Khrushchev doing more symmetric trade deals, which is what started to tip Mao off to this whole thing.
Oh, I see.
And then it goes to Mao puts missiles on the border, like these rocket launchers. So Khrushchev in turn puts his own rocket launchers on the border.
Wow. Okay.
And then they just kind of sit there for a while.
Okay, so they're in a standoff. Okay, so essentially Russia had been helping China along, saying, "Hey, we'll give you some good technology. We'll give you some good things because we want to see communism succeed in your country." Then Khrushchev says, "Well, we're giving you too much. We're not really getting anything in return. We want some more fair trade deals."
Mm-hmm.
Kind of interesting. You hear things about that sometimes in U.S. government foreign policy now about getting fair trade deals with China. But anyway, so Khrushchev in the 1960s was just saying, "Hey, we're not getting a good deal from you. We want a better deal."
Yeah.
And Mao's response to that was to say, "Oh yeah, you got a problem with us then, huh? We're gonna line up. We're gonna put some force right on the border."
Yeah.
And then they get into a standoff. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah. And then Mao is like, "All right,
How long does Mao rule for?
He rules until 77. And
I was about to say, do you think we should we've been going for a while. You think we should do another?
Yeah, and then the next episode we'll talk about Cultural Revolution and the death of Mao.
Okay. I think that's good. I think we covered a lot of good ground in this episode. So, is there any final words you want to say about this this period of Mao's and Mao Zedong's power in China?
Man, some of the most insane things in the history of communism happened in China.
Yeah.
Who would have thought?
Yeah, the 45 million people during the Great Leap Forward. It's interesting how you hear politicians now talk about going forward and going forward for the U.S. and things like that, and it triggers. When I hear those things like those words, we want to go forward. It kind of makes me think of things like that. That's what the politicians said then: is we're going forward.
Yeah.
We're going forward, marching to your mass starvation. Anyway. So, good episode, good job. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And tune in again next time for our next episode where we do another one on Mao Zedong. Are we going to have any more on China after that, after 1977? Is there more?
Nah, because next episode we're just going to death and then just briefly overview Dang.
Okay, briefly overview Dang, and then we can talk about some of the other places like Cuba. I think Cuba would be interesting.
Cuba is definitely Cuba is one episode, but definitely
Cuba.
important.
Okay, because it's so close. I mean, we're here in Florida. Cuba is so close. Maybe it can all be done in one episode, but I would be interested in exploring that in depth because it's so close to home here. But anyway. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you in the next episode on China, and then we'll be doing Cuba after that, and we hope to see you all there.